Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's my third year in Australia. It's the third time. My first visit was 2016, and it's been a great learning experience for me because it's a church that I didn't know before, and in these last 2 years, a few things have happened in this church, as you know. The Royal Commission, the Plenary Council, so I am very grateful. I knew that it was hard to follow in the footsteps of Frank Brennan, but actually the chocolate cake factory is much harder. My remarks are divided in three parts. The first part will be an introduction on what it means to talk about the theology of the lay people in the Catholic Church today in comparison to the golden age of the theology of the laity in the 20th century. A second part will be about the view of the laity in Pope Francis, in his major document especially. And a third part, a few conclusions on what it means and it entails to be a Catholic lay person in the Catholic Church of today. I will try to give you some slides. I almost never use PowerPoint because you may have heard that power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. But so I'm trying to give some visual aid for that. So the first part, what is one of the problems of the Catholic Church today when we talk about the theology of the lay people? Is the problem is not only in the fact that we haven't applied and received what the theology of the laity had promised, especially beginning in the 1950s and at Vatican II. We have to be honest and acknowledging that there are limitations in the theology. So that it's a theology that I believe still has a lot to say, but there are limits. And this is very important to understand what's happening in the Church of today, because Pope Francis is the first Pope who has the courage and honesty to acknowledge that we cannot think that every problem will be fixed if we don't go beyond Vatican II. That Vatican II is the farthest point in how far we can go in the Catholic Church. This is one of the gifts of being, I think, a post-Vatican II Catholic. I mean, Pope Francis is the first post-Vatican II Pope because he was never a participant of the Second Vatican Council. He was ordained priest in 1969. After Vatican II, he received his theological formation during Vatican II, even if he's not comfortable in giving specifics of what he studied during those years. It's one of the years where he's cagey, I would say. But clearly he's not blind to the idea that there are limits that we should overcome. Here there is a discussion going on in the Catholic Church and in theology today about the necessity of a new phase, a new age in the theology of the lay people in the church, especially if we look at what the church is today and what lay people are today, with the most important book in Catholic theology in the 20th century, which was Yves Congar's essay on the theology of the lay person. 1953, a foundational book, an incredibly important book. There's no question about that. So here we see that Catholic theology since 1953 and at Vatican II defines the layperson and confines what the layperson is and does in a set of conditions that are very clear. First, the lay condition is a concession to human frailty. So the ordained, they are less frail than lay people. That was the idea. The layperson is defined basically by the exclusion from holy orders. If you still look at the Code of Canon Law today, the definition of the layperson is negative, not in the sense that lay people are bad people, but negative because it proceeds via negativa. It says the layperson is not ordained, which is saying you are not a tree, which is not exactly what you are. Okay? But this is, I mean, how that theology worked. Why was that? It was not mostly a moralistic view on the lay people as frail, as ontologically different, as many young priests now like to talk about themselves as ontologically different from lay people. This is something that has come up in the last few years. It was rooted basically in the idea that there is a fundamental dualism between the church and the world. The church back then was conceived as a perfect institution, basically separated from the world. And so that separation, church and world, was mirrored in the different kinds of membership in the Catholic Church. Those who are fully members of the church and that are separated are the ordained. And there is a concession to the worldly necessity of being church that are lay people who are active in the world. So lay people being active in the church is not really part of the golden age, of the beginning of a theology of the lay people, which means for us a lot of things. It means that there is no real theology of the world, there's no theology of creation, there's no theology of the secular dimension in the 1950s. So here, Yves Congar really tries to break that system, but that book is still functioning in that kind of world fundamental. One thing that emerged from the Second Vatican Council and from Yves Congar's works on is that there is a confusion back then, evident still today, between what a lay person is according to the canonical definition, so the lay person is an unordained person, and the state of life. And so these two definitions don't coincide. You know as well as I do that there are many ordained people that have a much more secular, worldly life than many lay people, right? I mean, those flying bishops, okay? The bishops who spend 60–70% of the year in airport because they have to go. So this is more like a manager than a lay Catholic, as it was thought of in the 1950s. So that theology of the laity is still at the beginning of the breaking of an ecclesiology, of an idea of the church that is a fruit of the Council of Trent in the 16th century, that talked about a duplex ordo, a double order of things. There is the order of the Catholic Church, and there is the secular world. The church and the world are separated, are one against the other, basically. So here the world not just in the sense of the secular culture, but the world as a philosophical idea. The church is abstract from the creational order, which is something that if you read Laudato Si, and so we will read later this morning, so you see that this is no longer what the Catholic Church believes about the church and the world. What is the consequence of this idea that the church and the world are separated? It is that the church falls into a certain nominalism about what happens in the world. Nominalism means that the only thing that I know of things is the name. But I don't know the reality. Nominalism means that I know that this is the name of something, but I don't really know what's behind that name. And so this happened to the idea of the layperson. If you read the fundamental texts of the Second Vatican Council and of the post-Vatican II period until recently on what the layperson in the church is, you have a nominalistic understanding of it. So you have a very limited perception of what the layperson is. According to the golden age of the theology of the laity, the ideal model of the layperson was male, white, European or Western world, middle class, so not too rich, because it's not good for the Catholic Church to be outrageously rich, except in the US, so there is fine. And not be too poor because you don't want to look like a communist. So that was, so which in the global church of today is no longer what the average Catholic layperson is for sheer reasons of geography. That's so. From that kind of nominalism descended a few consequences for what is the role, the authority, the power of the layperson in the church back then. So when Vatican II talks about the office of sanctifying, the liturgical role of the layperson, the Second Vatican Council talks about the common priesthood of the laity, but it's clear that the layperson in the church has no power coming from God in the same way that that power goes to the ordained. The office of governing, there is no possibility of lay participation, no lay participation to the governing of the church. Lay people have a right to be governed. They have no right to govern. And this is still nominalistic because, as you know, we may think that everything that moves in the Catholic Church is still moved by the clergy, but that's certainly not true anymore. And so this is something that we should disabuse ourselves. So we tend to give them much more power than they actually have, I think, especially these days. Third, the office of teaching. So the lay people at the Second Vatican Council, they are seen as a bridge between the church and the secular world, church and culture. There is the idea of lay theologians, but only as bridge towards the outside. But there's no idea that lay theologians can have an impact on the theology of the church. That's it will become real in the post-Vatican II, but not in the Second Vatican Council. So here you have an idea of those limitations. And my impression is that much of the developments in the Catholic Church about the conception of the laity has happened indirectly. That is, in absence of a reflection of a new age, of a new phase of thinking on the laity. This is quite normal for the Catholic Church. Most changes in church history happen before there's a reflection on it. So the reflection follows, included the magisterial reflection of the bishops and of the Pope. We know that there will be some kind of ecclesiological revolution in the Catholic Church as a consequence of the clerical sex abuse. We know that it will happen. We don't know yet what kind of shape it will have, but we know that, I mean, the sex abuse crisis is the most serious crisis since the Protestant Reformation. There's no question about that. And so we're talking 500 years. And so this is the magnitude. So this will have a huge impact on how to understand the role of the laity in the Catholic Church. There have been new forms of life in the Catholic Church, the new Catholic movements, new ecclesial lay movements, Focolare, Sant'Egidio, all this, new clerical lay movements like Opus Dei, which is a pre-Vatican II idea that tries to look Vatican II really. It isn't, in my opinion, but that's part of the long 20th century of the Catholic Church. The clearest limit for Catholic theology talking about the laity, if we compare today with the 1950s, 60s, is evidently the role of women in the Catholic Church, which is evidently a big hole that we need to fill in the theological thinking. I would say much more than in the practice. The practice is more advanced than the reflection, in some countries at least. So here, there is one thing though that we have to be aware of, and this is, it is really part of what happened in these last few years. An introduction, a few things have happened since 2015. Many things that have a big impact on how the church works and how the church thinks. One of these things, if you look at how Catholics have voted in the last elections in the US, in Italy, in Hungary, in Poland, in the United Kingdom, is that what was typical and reassuring to some extent of the theology of the laity in the golden age, 1950s, 60s, it was the assumption that lay Catholics were going to be on the progressive side of the Catholic Church. So that the bishops were politically more conservative, or socially more conservative, and the lay Catholics were naturally, because they were in the world, the globalized world, democracy, globalization, capitalism, they were looking forward to the future, a progressive worldview. In many Catholic countries, this is gone. This is gone. You have that, I mean, some of the nastiest, most reactionary voices come from lay people in the Catholic Church. My own country, Italy. So I don't believe they represent the entirety of the Catholic lay population in Italy, but certainly they want to look Catholic lay people who advocate for what the real people feel and believe and want from their government. And there is an inversion, because if you look at what Pope Francis says on immigrants, refugees, he is on the progressive side of things, and many lay Catholics are. So the this is really part of a significant change, especially in the Western world. This assumption that being a lay Catholic means that you have a more progressive, that's no longer true, and we don't know if that will change. That it may take 10 years or a generation or a century. So we are here for a very long journey, I think, because the phases we are living is clearly a moment in the crisis, a disruption of globalization, and it's also a disruption of Catholic globalization. And the theology of the laity was one of the ways of the Catholic Church to interpret and accompany globalization. So now you have that the most visible thinker and speaker in the Catholic Church that thinks that we have a failure in globalization that though cannot become a neo-nationalist age is Pope Francis. Well, many lay Catholics in the US, for example, they think that globalization, an international world order is inherently anti-Catholic. So neo-nationalism in the United States is fueled by many Catholics. I mean, Steve Bannon, the most important advisor of Donald Trump during the campaign, he presents himself as a Catholic, as a Zionist Catholic, as an Irish Catholic, as an American Catholic, with a very distinct worldview. So this is the context where I think we are. Let's move to the second section, which is what Pope Francis says about the lay person in the church. The fundamental thing is that Pope Francis talks about the lay people and the role of the lay people mostly by saying bad things about clericalism. It's his negative way of talking about the lay people. The most important text that I haven't used here because it's not technically a paper, but it's not one of the major teachings, is the letter that he sent in 2015 to the Canadian Cardinal Ouellet, who's the president of the Pontifical Council for Latin America. That is one of the very harsh texts of Pope Francis against clericalism. He says, for decades in the Catholic Church we have been told now it's the time for the laity, and that time never comes because it seems that our watch is broken. He uses that image, really. So he has an anti-clerical take on why it's important to reconsider the role of the laity. So I would focus here on, as a start, on Evangelii Gaudium, the first important document that he published, the exhortation of November 2013. And the important thing that makes us understand that how he looks at the church with a distinct role for the laity is when he talks about the church, when he says, Evangelii Gaudium 49, quote, "I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it has been out on the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and from clinging to its own security. I don't want a church concerned with being at the center and then ends by being caught up in a web of obsessions and procedures." End quote. So this is not a text that addresses directly the role of the laity, but I think it says something on how Pope Francis looks at the laity, because it doesn't come, as many things in this Pope, from an abstract intellectual reflection, but from his own experience. He's being Latin American, he's being Jesuit, he's being a non-academic Pope. He's the first Pope in quite some time who is a failed doctoral candidate. These are very interesting. So he has a radically non-intellectual, non-abstract approach to issues, and the issue of the laity is one of those. He talks in Evangelii Gaudium is fundamentally the rediscovery of the church as a missionary disciple, where everything is driven and is defined by mission. And this means that this Pope is much less concerned with maintenance of the church and much more focused on mission. So this, I believe, naturally opens for him the door to a less clerical understanding of the role of what the church is. In Evangelii Gaudium 70, he says we need to be a church less focused on Christian piety, especially when, quote, some people promote these expressions while not being in the least concerned with the advancement of society or the formation of the laity. And in certain cases, they do so in order to obtain economic benefits or some power over others. So he says the theology of the laity is not just a casual attitude towards lay people that is disconnected from interests, and interests are the power influence. So, as you know, this Pope has been accused of being a communist, of being a radical, and in some sense he is, because it's very hard to find in these text statements that are concerned with the protection of the status quo. What I think is happening is that he is waiting for other members of the church, bishops, local churches, to take the opportunity that he's giving to them. And the Plenary Council of Australia may be one of these occasions. We may be cynical about this. I'm not cynical, because I think that there is great opportunity there. I don't know how it will end, but I think the Australian bishops know that this is the last chance to start something, not getting something exactly right, because this never happens in the church, but to start something. I think this is in Evangelii Gaudium he says this church, in this world that he says we suffer from anonymity, so we live in a world of anonymity, of alienation, basically. He says the other church has to do accompaniment. And to do accompaniment, you don't need to be ordained. Actually, that's an obstacle often. Yes, because the sacral, hieratic idea of the priestly ministry is alienating many people. And so, if we look at this idea of the art of accompaniment, which is in Evangelii Gaudium and through the entire pontificate, the layperson is much better positioned than, in many contexts, than the non-layperson. And so this is Evangelii Gaudium. So missionary and lay people, they go together. Second document that I want to talk about very briefly, Amoris Laetitia, the post-synodal exhortation on marriage and family that was published after the defining moment of this pontificate, which was the synod of 2014-2015. For the first time, a synod of the bishops on one same subject in 12 months. That never happened before. One observation that we have to make is that it was a bishop where the voting members voting on family and marriage were all clergy, all bishops, except one, because in the Vatican they made a mistake, and so they appointed a member who's a non-priest, a lay brother or religious order. So they found out lame, and they allowed him, and it was quite interesting. So it is a document entirely on an eminently lay preoccupation, family and marriage. And so those couple of months of October 2014, October 2015, they were very stressful if you're following that professionally. But you could see that for the first time, the reality of the lay people was stepping into the aula in the Vatican where they were talking about things. Very, very striking. So a bishop saying, my parents were divorced, and by the way, is the same bishop we know has a gay brother who's an actor. So science fiction, church fiction, if we look back 10 years. Really, really. And so this document is interesting because it assumes a few things that reflect, I believe, a more serious reception of the experience of the lay people in the church. First of all, at the very beginning, Amoris Laetitia says, not every doctrinal issue in the Catholic Church must be settled by the Pope. There are local issues that must be dealt with locally. The Pope says that, not Hans Kung or a liberal theologian. So this is really big, I would say. In the 6th paragraph, the Pope invites bishops, when they deal with families and marriage, to be grounded in reality. It says that exactly. It uses that metaphor. Keep your feet on the ground. There is the idea that when the church talks about family and marriage, must be aware and concerned and careful in dealing with the fragilities of our time in family and in marriage. There is the assumption and the reception that it's no longer possible to talk about family and marriage and sexuality without taking seriously the huge anthropological changes of this last century. I mean, it's huge. Again, and here Pope Francis is a real Jesuit, I would say, because in the same synod when all this was happening, he said, we're going to make Paul VI, the Pope of humanity, a saint. The Catholic Church is not either or, it's always both and. So, but it's the most important document of this pontificate. I think. Finally, Amoris Laetitia is not just a document that comes from the experience of the synod, so that is the fruit of a synodal experience. It is built and it was released and it has been seen by Pope Francis from the very beginning as a document that must be received synodally. That's why he didn't respond to these four cardinals who were raising doubts on the orthodoxy of this document, because he basically said, well, we'll find out what this document really means. So this happens because there is a much more serious understanding, I believe, of the role of the lay people in the church. Third and final document, the exhortation that was published last April on holiness. And it's interesting because a theologian always looks not just for what is in a document, but also for what is not in the document. This is usually the most important thing. And one example, in this very beautiful document on holiness, there is no mention of the idea that to be holy you have to live a life of asceticism. And it's totally absent. You may say, well, he's a Jesuit, so Jesuits are not very familiar with asceticism. They are more about the acting in the world and so on. That's true, but there's this idea that, so what happens there is that a disconnection of two things that for centuries were identified, which means being a holy man, holy woman, and being a part of the hierarchy. So these two things, they were assumed to be naturally one with the other. It's not Francis. Why? Because Pope Francis' idea of the church is basically that the church is a people. And in this is more radical than Vatican II, because Vatican II said the church is the people of God. So Pope Francis talks about the church as a people. So he says holiness is possible only if you belong to a people. And people in the Catholic Church, 99 point, I don't know how much percent, is made of lay people. So the only way to be holy is to belong of a people that is fundamentally made of lay people, with some exceptions. So here, Gaudete et Exultate is very, very interesting. It says that the church doesn't work, uses this expression in the paragraph 43, when he's responding to his critics. He says, quote, "It is true that for those who long for a monolithic body of doctrine guarded by all and leaving no room for nuance, this might appear as undesirable and leading to confusion." So he says, he says, I know that you think I'm creating confusion. And you're pretty much right. This is what I'm doing. Because Catholicism is not a monolithic body of doctrine, which is something that is naturally part of the awareness of the life of the Catholic lay person. Again, family, marriage, and so on. It is a much messier reality than abstract theory would like us to believe. There is an anti-elitist idea of the church in Francis. Here Francis is a radical anti-elitist. This is one of the 2-3 key ideas that is very important for Francis. And at paragraph 57, there's another great quote. The result of this obsession with a monolithic body of doctrine, the result is a self-centered and elitist complacency bereft of true love. This finds expression in a variety of apparently unconnected ways of thinking and acting. An obsession with the law, an absorption with social and political advantages, a punctilious concern for the church's liturgy, doctrine, and prestige, a vanity about the ability to manage practical matters, an excessive concern with programs of self-help and personal fulfillment. I believe you can identify much more clergy with this than the lay people. So he's an anti-elitist, and this is the way, is one of the ways the theology of the laity finds a new door in the papal teaching. The following paragraph, 58, he says, not infrequently, contrary to the promptings of the Spirit, the life of the church can become a museum piece or the possession of a select few. This can occur when some groups of Christians give excessive importance to certain rules, customs, or ways of acting. End quote. So the anti-clerical, anti-elitist gate is one of the ways the theology of the lay people, I think, finds a great development in this pontificate. There is a second main gate in Pope Francis which is a great opening for understanding why he understands the lay person, the Catholic Church, in a different way, and it's that Pope Francis sees the laity through the lens of the poor. He sees everything in the church through the lens of the poor. Everything. Liturgy, doctrine, canon law, everything through the lens of the poor. That are his glasses, or his eyes, really. The laity means that for him. So when, in some sense, at Vatican II, you had that the ideal typical layperson was a white, male, middle class, member of Catholic Action, voting for the Catholic Party, this kind of thing. So you see that in this different emphasis for Francis, he says the ideal typical person that should have more power in the church is the poor person. So you have a shift that is part of the changes in the sociological composition of the Catholic Church. There's no magisterial document that says now most of the Catholic Church is shifting towards the global South, Latin America, Africa, and Asia, and therefore our assumptions about the laity should change according to that kind of demographic shift. You don't have this kind of document, but you can breathe this from Francis. And so this theme of the poor, I'm not focusing on this right now because it will be part of Laudato Si later. But it's, if you want, is the most disturbing element for some Catholics in the global Catholic Church, especially, I would say, in the United States, where both conservative Catholics and liberal Catholics, they are both I would say, indifferent or puzzled by this emphasis on the poor. As you know, in the United States, being poor means basically being invisible, voiceless, powerless. And so this Pope talking about the poor, it's something that both conservatives and liberals cannot quite understand why he's doing that. It is funny and it's tragic at the same time. So there's a total blindness. The Catholic Church, it has become the most important church in the West, basically by getting rich. So this thing of the poor, it sounds like a threat to go back when Catholics were poor immigrants from Ireland, second-class citizens. We don't want to go back there. And so this Pope is seen as a threat to the achievements of American Catholicism in this last century. He wants to take us back to the 1920s, 1930s. I try to empathize. I mean, I try to understand that collective psychological take on why this Pope. But this is part, I think, of Pope Francis' understanding of the layperson. So here are a few final thoughts on a few elements of context that I think we should take into account when we talk about this necessity of a transition from a theology of the late 1950s, 1960s, Vatican II not having part of the church, and what Pope Francis is opening. And again, this is something that strangely is happening more at the level of the papal teaching than at the level of the theological reflection, which is unusual, because usually theologians, they lay the foundations for papal teaching to make a step. This time Pope Francis on this issue, it seems to me, that is more advanced, with one big exception, and we can talk about that in the debate if you want. He doesn't get really the correct and theologically adequate way to talk about women in the church. This is, it's part of being Jesuit, of being Latin American, of being born in 1936, a number of things. So that is a danger zone. Whenever he talks about women, I really pray that he says nothing that will make my day very hard. But here Francis is saying things that on the lay people and on anti-clericalism that I believe are more radical than what most theologians now say. So, first, I think that one of the elements of context that we should take into account now to understand what's happening in the teaching on the laity is the clerical sexual abuse. So we are in an age where the favorite sport of American Catholic conservatives in the US is to vent their dream that all the bishops were fired at once and they will be in charge of the Catholic Church because bishops are part of the status quo. That clergy has become the symbol of corruption in the Catholic Church. And so this is the spirit of our times in the Catholic Church, the zeitgeist. It has become quite unpopular to say, for example, I have known many good bishops, I've known many holy priests. It has become, you are automatically identified with the defenders of abusers. So The problem is, why is this a problem? I believe because it distorts a theology of the laity that shouldn't be founded on a Jacobin or Bolshevik revolution in the Catholic Church trying to cut as many heads as possible. I don't think this is a Christian way to do this. So here, I think we live in a time when there are very legitimate demands for a much more visible and much more powerful, empowered role of the lay person in the Catholic Church. I don't think it would be helpful that that springs up because we have decimated and totally delegitimized the rest of the Catholic Church. I don't know if the Catholic Church can recover from a total delegitimization of ordained ministry. That's it's not very popular to say that these days, especially in the United States. But what the vertical crisis that the institution of the Catholic Church is suffering in the Western world is a key factor in understanding what is going to happen to the role of the Catholic laity. Because from what I have seen happening in the church in the US in the last few years, it's very clear that if you create a totally lay-led church, you know exactly who will have power in the Catholic Church. The same people who gave millions of dollars to Congress to pass some kind of laws. There's no question of that. And Donald Trump would be very happy with that. Extremely happy. Because the Catholic bishops in the West right now are the only ones who are expressing a radical concern for immigrants, separated families, the world and so on. So here there are a few things that I think we should consider. More generally, if we look at what the Catholic Church is globally today, it has become impossible to say the clergy is this, the lay people are this. It has become much more diversified, much more being a lay person in the United States is very different from being a lay person in Nigeria. Being a bishop in the United States means basically being a CEO of a company that is downsizing and liquidating real estate. So this is what most of the time they do. Being a bishop in other countries, in Myanmar or Tonga, or it's a different kind of business. So it has become very hard to describe sociologically what these two kinds of people. So, short story, we no longer have, as we used to for many, many centuries, this very easy description in Latin was there are duo genera Christianorum, two different kinds of Christians. The ordained, and it's very clear what they do, what they are, and the non-ordained, and it's very clear. This has become impossible because we have churches living in majority Christian countries or majority Catholic countries. The definition of what is a mission country has become completely turned upside down because Europe is now a mission country and not Nigeria, for example. So this changes a lot. It changes because the way the Catholic laity is involved in church politics and in national politics, it changes completely from country to country. I've seen in these last 3 years, I mean, of my last 24 months, I've spent 2 months in Australia, which is not much by your standards, but by usual standards of a European or North American theologian is more than. So if you look at what's happening in the United States, you have a creeping civil war kind of situation in the Catholic Church that is driven by lay people, not by the bishops. Bishops are simply trying to survive. Okay, but this war is driven by lay people, liberals versus conservatives, Republicans versus Democrats, and so on. It seems to me that this is at least not yet one of the problems of the Catholic Church in this country. So you have different kind of divisions, it seems to me. But it's not you either vote for the Democrats and you are in favor of abortion laws, or you vote for the Republicans and you use abortion laws to justify whatever the Republicans want to do, basically. So, being a lay person in the Catholic Church in the US, so it is much more defining in the US to be a Catholic Democrat or a Catholic Republican than to be a lay person or an ordained person. So that has become the duo genera Christianorum, the two kinds of Christians, Democrats or Republicans. But this is exactly my daily life there, especially as a professional theologian. And you have to be very, very mindful of that when, for example, you step into a classroom of students. I mean, it's a totally divided country, a totally divided church. So being ordained, non-ordained layperson is less important in this country. Third, there are different kinds of sense of the church that have an impact on the way of being lay people. For example, I lived for 7 years in Minneapolis, in the upper Midwest of the United States, close to the border with Canada, when in the winter you have weeks at -20, -30. I survived, but it was striking there that you have a very conservative culture of the Catholic clergy, but at the same time, a very strong sense of ownership of the local church by Catholic lay people. Very strong sense of this is our parish, which is now totally absent in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, where I have been living since 2016. It's an extremely clerical church and a totally passive laity. And it's a laity in Philadelphia that is politically more progressive, but it's totally alienated from the sense that this is our church. It's clearly the bishop's church. So here again, the abstract definitions of what a lay person is has become much less relevant, much less clear than it used to be. I forgot to. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Last few. So here, I believe that the challenge for us who want to understand the Catholic Church and the role of the laity in the Catholic Church is to be part of a long-term process of discernment. Because there are issues that will not be solved by the magisterium, will not be solved by theologians. So discernment is one of the buzzwords of Pope Francis. He says what God is expecting from us is to recover what he calls the synodal dimension of the Catholic Church, where there has to be the sense that this church is journeying together towards somewhere, that this is moving. So the usual preoccupation of the average bishop or some priests is to ask a theologian like me, when is all this change going to end? and my duty is to respond, change will never end. But it's a change that here Francis is saying works through discernment, and discernment is it's a theological idea that has always been part of the Jesuit culture, but it has become part of the official language of the church, talking about the church itself quite recently. Why? Because discernment can become revolutionary. Discernment doesn't rely on the fact that supposedly an ordained person is spiritually more enlightened than a lay person. The discernment of the Spirit doesn't care if you're ordained or not. And so this is, I believe, a very interesting time in the history of the Catholic Church, especially in Australia, because I'm not part of the plenary council of the preparation and so on, but you can be sure of one thing, that there's no other church in the world that is doing this. There's no other church in the world, well, many other churches see this as a nightmare, as something that will never happen in our church like the United States. Because if you now call a plenary council in the West, it's like launching, it's like a flamethrower. You cannot really know what's going to be left of what is in front of you if you use a flamethrower. So I don't know what will happen, but I know that the lay people of the Catholic Church in Australia have a huge opportunity to be listened to listen, to speak, to don't take that for granted, because it's not something that I think can be dismissed. And so I think Pope Francis will look at what will happen to the plenary council in Australia, and also many other Catholics, because in some sense the church in Australia, with all its challenges of the Royal Commission and so on, is the most advanced example of the kind of church I think Pope Francis has in mind. It's a big responsibility, and yeah, I will stop here. Thank you for your patience, and I don't know what happens now.